Somewhere along the way, you learn to measure yourself against whispers, screens, and silence instead of listening to your own body. Tonight, you're invited to slow down and unlearn the noise. This is not a lesson in performance or perfection. It's a quiet return to understanding how desire arrives, how arousal unfolds, how pleasure speaks in its own timing. As you listen, you'll begin to notice relief settling in, like an exhale you didn't know you were holding. Nothing here asks you to compare or rush. This journey is about curiosity, compassion, and reclaiming confidence through knowledge. You don't need to become someone new. You only need to understand yourself more deeply. Chapter 1: Letting Go of the Myth of Normal. You begin this journey by confronting a word that has quietly shaped your expectations for years: normal. It's a word that seems harmless, even reassuring, yet it carries an invisible weight. Somewhere along the way, you learn to ask yourself if you were normal in bed, if your timing was normal, if your reactions were normal, if your body was normal. And each time you ask that question, you placed yourself on trial without realizing it. What you were never told is that normal was never a single point. It was always a wide landscape. When it comes to sex, bodies do not move in straight lines or follow strict schedules. They respond to context, safety, memory, stress, curiosity, connection. They change over time. And yet, you may have grown up believing that something was wrong with you simply because your experience didn't match a story you absorbed from elsewhere. As you sit with this chapter, you're invited to gently loosen your grip on comparison. The truth is, most people you admire for their confidence once sat where you are now, quietly wondering if they were alone in their doubts. They weren't, and neither are you. What often gets labeled as a problem is really just a gap in understanding, a missing explanation that was never offered. You may have noticed how quickly worry appears when desire feels absent or pleasure takes longer than expected. Your mind rushes ahead, filling in blanks with fear. Why isn't this happening faster? Why don't I feel what I'm supposed to feel? But bodies don't respond well to pressure. They respond to permission. And permission begins with knowing that variation is not failure. It's biology meeting life as it actually is. When you release the need to meet an imagined standard, something subtle shifts. Curiosity replaces judgment. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you begin asking, "What's happening for me?" That question opens a door rather than closing one. It allows you to listen instead of evaluate. This chapter isn't about dismissing your concerns. Your experiences matter. Your frustrations are real, but understanding reframes them. Many of the worries you carry are not signs of dysfunction. They're signs of being human in a culture that rarely explains how sexual experience truly works. Once you recognize that, the tension begins to soften. You also start to see how deeply silence has shaped your beliefs. When no one talks openly about sex, myths fill the space. Screens exaggerate, stories simplify, and suddenly you're measuring yourself against edited moments instead of lived reality. Education, in this sense, is not about adding pressure, it's about removing it. As this chapter comes to a close, you're not being asked to change anything yet. There's no technique to master, no behavior to fix. For now, your only task is to allow yourself to be exactly where you are without self blame. Understanding begins here, in the quiet recognition that your experience doesn't need to be justified to be valid. And with that recognition, you're ready to move forward toward understanding how desire actually begins and why it so often arrives in ways you were never told to expect. Chapter 2: How Desire Really Begins. You may have been taught to believe that desire is supposed to strike like lightning, sudden, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. When it doesn't arrive that way, doubt creeps in. You start wondering if something inside you has dimmed or disappeared. But desire is far more nuanced than that, and understanding this changes everything. Sometimes desire is spontaneous. It appears out of nowhere, uninvited yet welcome. This kind of desire often feels effortless, and when you experience it, you may assume this is how it's always supposed to work. But over time, many people notice that this lightning bolt version becomes less frequent. Stress, familiarity, emotional load, aging, and life itself all influence how desire shows up. And none of that means something is broken. There's another form of desire that rarely gets talked about, yet it may be the one you experience most often. It's responsive desire. Instead of appearing first, it follows connection. You don't feel in the mood until something begins. Touch, closeness, laughter, a shared moment of safety. Desire doesn't lead the experience, it grows inside it. And the moment you realize this, a quiet relief can wash over you. If you've ever agreed to intimacy without feeling particularly excited, only to find yourself enjoying it once things unfold, you've experienced responsive desire. And if you've ever judged yourself for needing time, warmth, or context before wanting sex, this chapter gently asks you to let that judgment go. Your body isn't lagging behind. It's responding exactly as it was designed to. Desire is deeply personal, and it doesn't operate on command. It's influenced by how safe you feel, how seen you feel, and how connected you are, not just to another person, but to yourself. When life feels overwhelming, desire often waits patiently in the background. It doesn't disappear. It simply needs an invitation rather than a demand. You may notice that your mind plays a powerful role here. Anticipation, memory, and meaning all shape desire. When intimacy feels like obligation, desire shrinks. When it feels like exploration, desire has room to breathe. This is why creating space for desire matters more than chasing it. Understanding this frees you from the myth that you should always want sex at the same time or in the same way as someone else. Desire isn't a shared switch, it's an individual rhythm. Learning yours doesn't distance you from connection, it deepens it. It allows you to communicate honestly instead of performing expectation. As this chapter fades, you're left with a new lens. Desire isn't something you've lost. It's something that responds to how you're living, like how you're feeling, and how much permission you give yourself to ease into experience rather than rush toward it. And once desire has space to exist, your body begins preparing in its own quiet ways, leading you into the next phase of understanding, arousal, and the remarkable intelligence behind it. Chapter 3: Listening to the Language of Arousal. Arousal is not an instant switch, it's a conversation, one your body holds with itself long before you notice the obvious signs. When you understand this, impatience softens into awareness. You stop asking your body to perform and start allowing it to respond. As arousal begins, blood flow shifts, nerves awaken, breath subtly deepens. These changes don't announce themselves loudly. They build gradually, influenced by comfort, safety, curiosity, and time. Yet many people expect arousal to be immediate, especially if physical signs appear quickly. This misunderstanding creates pressure, and pressure interrupts the very process you're waiting for. You might notice that arousal unfolds differently depending on the moment, the partner, or even the day you've had. Sometimes it arrives easily, other times it takes patience. Neither experience is more correct than the other. Your body isn't inconsistent, it's responsive. Mental arousal plays an equally important role. If your thoughts are scattered or tense, your body often hesitates. This doesn't mean you lack desire. It means your nervous system hasn't yet received the signal that it's safe to relax. When you allow yourself to slow down through touch, presence, or simply attention, arousal often follows naturally. Time is a crucial ingredient here. Many bodies require several minutes to fully prepare for pleasurable sensation. Rushing past this stage can lead to discomfort, disconnection, or frustration. But when you give arousal the space it needs, sensation deepens. Pleasure becomes layered rather than rushed. You may also notice differences between you and a partner. One of you might warm up quickly while the other takes longer. This isn't imbalance,
कुछ
it's
डीमैट अकाउंट
variation.
नाइक
When
एनुअल
you stop interpreting difference as incompatibility, you create room for collaboration instead of comparison. Arousal isn't about achieving a certain state as fast as possible. It's about noticing what your body is already doing. It's about tuning in rather than pushing forward. When you listen closely, your body offers cues, subtle invitations that guide you toward comfort and pleasure. This chapter asks you to replace urgency with curiosity, to see arousal not as a hurdle to clear, but as an unfolding process worth experiencing in its own right. When you do, the rest of the journey begins to feel less like a race and more like a shared rhythm. And as arousal deepens, tension builds, not as something to fear, but as energy gathering toward release. Understanding that release and what it truly means is where the journey takes you next. Chapter 4: Redefining the Meaning of Release. You've likely been taught to think of orgasm as the finish line, the moment everything is supposed to lead toward. But when you place all the meaning there, you miss what's actually happening inside you. Release is not a performance, it's a physiological response layered with emotion, sensation, and timing, and it unfolds differently for every body. As arousal builds, your body gathers tension. Muscles subtly contract, breath changes, awareness narrows. This tension isn't something to rush away, it's part of the experience. When release happens, it's simply that tension finding expression. For some people, it's intense and unmistakable. For others, it's gentle, wave like, or even elusive. None of these versions are more valid than another. You may have noticed that release doesn't always arrive when expected. Sometimes it comes quickly, other times it feels just out of reach, and sometimes it doesn't come at all. What you were rarely told is that this variability is common. It doesn't mean you failed, and it doesn't mean the experience was incomplete. Pleasure does not require a specific ending to be real. Your body's response to stimulation is influenced by many factors: fatigue, stress, safety, trust, focus. When your mind is preoccupied, your body may struggle to let go. This isn't a flaw, it's information. It's your nervous system asking for conditions that allow surrender rather than effort. You might also discover that release doesn't always coincide with the same physical markers. Sensation and satisfaction don't follow a strict script. Some experiences feel deeply fulfilling without a dramatic peak. Others surprise you with intensity when you least expect it. Learning to notice satisfaction beyond a single moment widens your understanding of pleasure. There's also an important truth here. Release is not a requirement for intimacy to matter. When you remove that expectation, pressure dissolves. You stop chasing an outcome and start inhabiting the experience. Ironically, this often makes release more likely, not because you're trying harder, but because you're allowing more. You may have learned to measure yourself by how easily or reliably you reach that peak. This chapter invites you to measure something else instead: how present you felt, how connected you were, how much you allowed yourself to feel. Those qualities shape satisfaction far more than any stopwatch ever could. When release does happen, your body transitions again. Hormones shift, muscles soften. There's a natural settling that follows, a return toward baseline. Understanding this rhythm helps you honor your body's needs afterward, whether that's rest, closeness, or simply stillness. As you move forward, you begin to see that pleasure isn't a single event. It's a process with many textures, many expressions. Release is one part of that process, not the definition of it. And when you stop defining success by a single moment, you open yourself to a deeper understanding of timing, how long things actually take, and why that timing was never meant to be compared in the first place. Chapter 5: Understanding Time Without Pressure. Time has a way of turning intimacy into a silent competition. You may find yourself counting minutes without realizing it, wondering if things are taking too long or ending too soon. These thoughts don't arise because your body is wrong. They arise because no one ever explained what timing actually looks like when it's grounded in reality rather than expectation. Your body moves at its own pace. Visible signs of readiness may appear quickly or slowly, but that doesn't mean the rest of you is prepared. Full arousal involves more than physical response. It includes attention, comfort, and emotional presence. When any of these are missing, time stretches, not as a flaw, but as a signal. You might have learned to associate speed with competence, faster arousal, quicker release, instant readiness. But the body doesn't operate on efficiency alone. It operates on safety, and safety can't be rushed. When you give yourself permission to take time, you allow your nervous system to settle instead of brace. It's also important to recognize that different bodies require different rhythms. One person may reach readiness in minutes, another may need far longer. These differences don't cancel each other out, they invite communication. When you stop assuming there's a correct timeline, you make room for collaboration rather than self criticism. You may have noticed that when you feel watched, evaluated, or pressured, everything slows or shuts down. This isn't resistance, it's protection. Your body is prioritizing well being over performance. When you honor that, instead of fighting it, you regain trust with yourself. Timing is also influenced by what happens before intimacy begins. Connection doesn't start at touch, it starts earlier, in conversation, in feeling appreciated, in feeling seen. When those needs are met, your body often responds more easily, not because it owes anything, but because it feels invited. You are not behind. You are not late. You are not early. You are exactly where your body is meant to be in that moment. When you internalize this, something powerful shifts. You stop racing toward an outcome and start noticing the experience unfolding in real time. This chapter isn't asking you to ignore your desires or your partners. It's asking you to release the stopwatch, to understand that satisfaction is not measured in minutes, but in presence. When time becomes a companion instead of a judge, intimacy softens, pleasure deepens, connection expands. And as you step out of comparison with time, another comparison begins to lose its grip, the one tied to bodies themselves. Size, shape, appearance. The next chapter invites you to meet those concerns with clarity, honesty, and compassion. Chapter 6: Making Peace with Bodies. At some point, you may have looked at your body and wondered if it was enough, not in a general sense, but in specific, quiet moments when comparison crept in uninvited. These doubts rarely come from personal experience alone. They're learned, absorbed from images and narratives that present only a narrow slice of reality. Bodies vary far more than you were shown. Shape, size, color, symmetry. These differences are not anomalies, they are the norm. Yet when you're exposed repeatedly to curated representations, it's easy to believe your own body falls short of an invisible standard. This belief can quietly erode confidence, even when there is no physical limitation at all. Your body is not designed to meet an aesthetic ideal. It's designed to function, adapt, and respond. In moments of arousal, it changes in ways that are purposeful and intelligent. Tissues expand, muscles adjust, sensation heightens. These shifts aren't random, they're preparation. When you understand this, fear gives way to respect. You may have worried that your body was too much or not enough in some way, too large, too small, too different. But bodies are not meant to be matched like puzzle pieces. They're meant to communicate. Comfort, pleasure, and satisfaction come from responsiveness, not measurements. It's also important to understand that what you see externally is only part of the story. Much of sexual anatomy works beneath the surface, unseen yet essential. When you focus only on what's visible, you miss the complexity that actually shapes sensation. Education helps replace assumptions with understanding, and understanding builds confidence. You might have also internalized myths about change, that bodies become worn over time or altered by experience in ways that reduce pleasure. These ideas persist because they sound plausible, not because they're true. The body is resilient. It adapts, it heals, it responds to how it's treated, not how it's judged. When you make peace with your body, intimacy becomes less about proving and more about experiencing. You stop monitoring how you look and start noticing how you feel. That shift alone can transform pleasure. Presence replaces self consciousness. Sensation becomes clearer. This chapter isn't asking you to suddenly love everything about your body. It's asking you to stop viewing it as an obstacle. Your body is not the reason for disconnection, it's the pathway back to it. When you treat it with curiosity instead of criticism, it responds with openness. As you settle into this understanding, you're better prepared to challenge the beliefs that created insecurity in the first place. The next chapter gently dismantles some of the most persistent myths you may still be carrying and replaces them with truths that offer relief instead of pressure. Chapter 7: Unlearning the Stories That Create Anxiety. Some of the most powerful forces shaping your sexual experience are not physical at all. They are stories, quiet assumptions you absorbed long before you had the language to question them. These stories tell you what sex is supposed to look like, how pleasure is supposed to happen, and what it means if it doesn't. Over time, they create anxiety where curiosity should live. One of the most common stories says that pleasure should come automatically, that if connection is right, everything else should fall into place without effort. When it doesn't, you may assume something is missing: chemistry, compatibility, or desire itself. But this belief ignores a simple truth: intimacy is a skill. Like any skill, it improves with attention, communication, and practice. Another story suggests that pleasure follows a single pathway, that certain experiences count more than others. When this idea takes hold, you may dismiss sensations that don't fit the script. You may overlook what feels good in favor of what you think should feel good. This disconnect can quietly drain satisfaction, even when your body is offering clear signals of enjoyment. You may also have been taught that wanting different things or wanting them at different times signals a problem. But desire fluctuates. It responds to life, health, emotion, and environment. Expecting yourself or someone else to want the same thing at the same intensity indefinitely is unrealistic. When you release that expectation, tension softens and honesty becomes possible. Another deeply ingrained myth equates discomfort with normalcy. That pain is something to endure, dismiss, or push through. But pain is not a requirement for intimacy, and it is never something you should ignore. Your body uses discomfort as communication, not punishment. Listening to it is an act of care, not weakness. These stories persist because they're rarely challenged. They pass quietly from one generation to the next, reinforced by silence. When no one explains what's actually common, myths fill the gap. Anxiety grows not because something is wrong, but because understanding is missing. Unlearning these stories doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, each time you choose curiosity over judgment. Each time you ask a question instead of making an assumption. Each time you allow your experience to be valid without comparison. As you shed these narratives, something important happens. Responsibility shifts. You stop asking intimacy to prove your worth. You start seeing it as a shared space of exploration. Pleasure becomes something you participate in, not something you're evaluated on. This chapter leaves you with a quieter mind and more room to breathe. And with that space comes the ability to connect, not just physically, but emotionally and verbally. Because understanding alone isn't enough. The next step is learning how to share it through conversation that builds trust instead of fear. Chapter 8: Learning to Speak the Unspeakable. You may have noticed that even after understanding your body more clearly, something still feels difficult. Not physically, but verbally. Talking about sex can feel awkward, exposed, or even risky. Silence often feels safer. Yet silence is where misunderstandings grow and connection quietly thins. Communication isn't about having the perfect words, it's about creating safety. When you speak honestly about what you enjoy, what you're curious about, or what feels uncomfortable, you're not making demands. You're offering information. And that information allows intimacy to evolve instead of stagnate. You might worry about hurting someone's feelings or being judged. That fear is understandable. Many people were never shown how to talk about desire without shame. But avoidance doesn't protect connection, it limits it. When you keep your experience hidden, your partner can only guess. And guessing often leads to distance. Small conversations matter more than dramatic confessions. You don't need to reveal everything at once. Sometimes it starts with noticing what feels good and saying so. Sometimes it starts with curiosity, asking what your partner enjoys, what helps them feel connected, what they've never been asked before. These moments build trust slowly, naturally. It's also important to remember that communication isn't only verbal. Attention, responsiveness, and presence all speak volumes. When you listen, truly listen, you create a space where honesty feels safer on both sides. Intimacy deepens not through perfection, but through mutual willingness. You may also discover that communication includes boundaries. Saying no, slowing down, asking for time. These are not rejections, they are acts of self respect. When boundaries are honored, trust grows. And where trust exists, desire often follows. This chapter invites you to see conversation not as confrontation, but as collaboration. You're not trying to fix each other, you're learning together. When intimacy becomes a shared language rather than a silent test, pressure dissolves. As communication opens, you begin to experience sex less as a goal oriented activity and more as an unfolding exchange. This shift changes how you approach pleasure itself, not as something to achieve, but as something to inhabit. And that perspective leads you naturally into the final understanding: how to integrate everything you've learned into a relationship with intimacy that feels grounded, satisfying, and truly your own. Chapter 9: Shifting from Performance to Presence. At some point, without announcing itself, intimacy begins to feel different. Not because everything is suddenly effortless, but because you're no longer trying to prove anything. Performance loosens its grip, presence takes its place. You may recognize how often you once evaluated yourself mid experience, monitoring your body, your reactions, your timing. That habit didn't come from vanity. It came from survival in a culture that taught you to equate worth with outcome. But intimacy was never meant to be a test you pass or fail. It was meant to be a space you enter. Presence begins when you stop watching yourself from the outside and start inhabiting your body from within. Sensation becomes clearer, breath becomes deeper. You notice subtleties you once rushed past: the warmth of touch, the rhythm of closeness, the way connection feels when you allow it to unfold without direction. This doesn't mean goals disappear. Pleasure still matters. Satisfaction still matters. But they stop being demands, they become possibilities. When you're present, you respond instead of anticipate. You listen instead of rush. And your body often responds with more ease, not because you're doing something right, but because you've removed the pressure to do anything at all. You may also notice that presence invites playfulness. When performance fades, curiosity returns. There's room to explore, to laugh, to adjust. Intimacy becomes flexible instead of fragile. Mistakes don't derail connection, they humanize it. This shift affects how you relate to your partner as well. You stop measuring compatibility by how smoothly things go and start measuring it by how safely you can adapt together. That safety is what allows desire, arousal, and pleasure to flow more naturally over time. Presence also changes how you experience after intimacy ends. Instead of evaluating what happened, you simply notice how you feel: calmer, closer, more grounded. This is your body completing a cycle, returning to rest in its own time. Honoring that rhythm strengthens trust with yourself. You're not meant to arrive at this state once and stay there forever. Presence is a practice. Some days it comes easily, other days it slips away. What matters is knowing you can return to it, not by effort, but by permission. As this chapter closes, you may sense that something fundamental has shifted. Not your body, but your relationship with it. And with that shift, you're ready to integrate everything you've learned into a lasting understanding, one that carries forward beyond this moment into how you live, connect, and care for yourself. The final chapter brings this journey home. Chapter 10, Carrying This Understanding Forward. This journey was never meant to end with information alone. Knowledge becomes meaningful only when it softens how you treat yourself. As you move forward, what stays with you isn't a checklist of how intimacy should look, but a deeper trust in how your body responds when it's given patience, curiosity, and care. You now understand that your experience was never meant to match anyone else's. Desire arrives in its own time. Arousal unfolds at its own pace. Pleasure speaks in many languages. When you stop forcing alignment with an imagined standard, intimacy becomes less fragile and more forgiving. You allow yourself to be human within it. You may still encounter moments of doubt. Old stories don't disappear overnight, but now, when they surface, you have context. You can meet them with understanding instead of fear. You can pause, breathe, and remember that variation is not failure. It's life expressing itself through you. Carrying this understanding forward also means knowing when to ask for support. If something feels consistently uncomfortable, painful, or distressing, you don't have to endure it in silence. Seeking guidance is not an admission of weakness, it's an act of respect for your well being. You deserve experiences that feel safe and affirming. You're also invited to keep learning. Curiosity keeps intimacy alive. Conversations, whether with a partner, a trusted professional, or even yourself, create clarity. Each question you ask opens space for growth. Each honest reflection deepens self awareness. Perhaps the most important thing you take with you is this: your body is not an obstacle to pleasure, it is the pathway. When you listen to it, trust it, and care for it, intimacy becomes something you participate in rather than perform. As this audiobook comes to a close, there's nothing you need to fix, rush, or compare. Just remember this quiet truth: your experience is valid, your timing is your own, and your capacity for connection is far greater than you were ever led to believe. Carry that with you. It will continue working long after the last word fades.